Alright, our next episode of TNG is The Enemy. It's episode number 55. It originally aired on November 4th, 1989, and was written by David Kemper and Michael Piller, and directed by David Carson, who actually was the director of the first TNG movie. Now, plot-wise with this episode, an away team of Commander Riker, Lieutenant Worf, and Lieutenant Commander Geordi LaForge beamed down to Golornden Core, which was an inhospitable planet buffeted by severe electromagnetic storms. Now, the Enterprise received an unknown distress call from the planet and is investigating. LaForge locates a crashed Romulan craft, and the away team spreads out to search for the survivors. And when Riker and Worf return a few minutes later with a wounded Romulan, LaForge is missing. And the storm intensifies and they have to beam him back without him. And the storms on Golornden Core limit the use of the Enterprise's sensors, but Wesley suggests that they shoot down a neutrino beacon, and that neutrinos can basically pass through the storm. And when LaForge finds the beacon, he can alter its pulse rate, and this will help the Enterprise locate him. But, unfortunately, just before LaForge reaches the beacon, another Romulan attacks him from behind, and as the magnetic fields of the planet affect both LaForge and the Romulan, LaForge actually starts losing his vision, while the Romulan's legs start turning numb. And with no other choice, they decide that they have to work together in order to find that beacon. Now, meanwhile, a Romulan ship confronts the Enterprise and demands the return of the other Romulan soldier who's aboard the Enterprise. And he is basically near death, and the only person who is able to help him and be a donor for him is Lieutenant Worf, who does not want to do this because the Romulans were responsible for the death of his parents, and despite Picard and Crusher urging him to volunteer, Worf refuses. So Picard reluctantly advises the commander that the man is dead, and the commander readies a ship for war, but at that moment LaForge modifies the beam, and Picard beams both LaForge and the Romulan to the bridge, and the Romulan commander stands down when he realizes that LaForge and his man work together, and they decide to become neutral about it. And it's sufficient for him to beam back to the ship, and they go on their separate ways. So that is the plot of this episode. Now, interestingly enough, Michael Piller was actually very heavy in rewriting this episode, and he says this is one of the scripts that came the longest way from where it was in the beginning, and he says if it was to be about something, it really helped grow Worf's character immensely, because when he originally suggested that the Romulan die, actually the writing staff gasped in the room, and Michael Dorn actually objected to this and was curious, what are you doing with my character here? But once he realized the reason behind it, and the fact that Worf would object to this, despite on television the common thing being, of course, they do the right thing in the end, and they help the person out despite their prejudices. The character of Worf probably would not do that. He even says in the show that he feels like he'd have to turn his back on what he believes in, and basically is accepting and saying it's okay that the Romulans killed his family. Now, of course, it's wrong for Worf to feel and to blame that all Romulans are responsible for this, as Commander Riker points out. But Worf decides that he cannot help this Romulan, unfortunately. And I think that is actually a good thing for TNG, because it goes out of the mold of basically every other TV show, where everything works out perfectly in the end, like it would in a normal show. But this is the first time where they really focus on character, and that's the most important thing. So it really stands out to me for TNG. So I think this was a good decision, and it's more realistic about people's attitudes in the world sometimes. So I think that was a positive as well. Now, there are some interesting guest stars in this episode. The first one that I want to mention is Andreas Katsulas. I'm probably botching his last name there. But he is pretty well known because he is a repeated guest on The Next Generation, and he plays the Romulan Commander Tomalak, as you can see in this picture. This is the first time we see him through this episode, but he makes several return visits, and he really has a presence on TNG in my mind, and I really enjoyed him as one of the characters. And when I think of the Romulans, he was one of the first ones that I think of on TNG. But you may also remember him in several other roles. In the movie The Fugitive, he actually plays the one-armed man, and he has a great turn there, scoring off against Harrison Ford. And probably what he's best known for is the role of Ambassador Jakar in the sci-fi series Babylon 5, for those of you who followed that series. I think that's where he shines probably the most in that role, and really ate up the scenery with that character as Jakar. Interestingly enough, the other guest star, John Snyder, he portrayed, he was also, he was the Romulan Bakra who worked with LaForge to help them find that beacon. But he was also a soul hunter in Babylon 5, and also played Orin Zento in the episode By Any Means Necessary of Babylon 5. So that's kind of interesting that both of those guys ended up appearing on B5 too. And if you haven't watched any episodes of Babylon 5, I really encourage you to do so. The first season, it took me a while to get into it, but once you do, you're kind of hooked like that. And I encourage you to watch it the whole way through. I think it's a pity, too, that poor Andreas lived a relatively short life. He died at age 59. He loved smoking and was a heavy smoker, so he died of lung cancer and died in 2006. So, and unfortunately, another character who was on Babylon 5 died very early too. Michael O'Hare, who played Commander Sinclair in the first season, actually a Chicago native where I'm from, he died at age 62, and the reason for that was a heart attack, but he kept secret during the first season of Babylon 5 that he left the show really because he was suffering from mental illness, and he had suffered from paranoid delusions, and halfway through the filming his hallucinations worsened, and the stress of playing a character who was also suffering from mental illness was just too much for him. And Michael O'Hare just didn't, the producers actually offered for them to delay the taping of the second season for him to get some help, but O'Hare just didn't want to put that burden on the other actors, so they decided to write his character off the show at that point, although he did make some guest appearances. So, interesting enough, and we lost Michael O'Hare about a year ago, September 2012, but I enjoyed him even though he had a short time on Babylon 5, and I especially enjoyed Andreas as Jakar, and of course here is Commander Tomalak in TNG. So some great crossovers here between The Next Generation and Babylon 5 here. If you haven't checked out Babylon 5, it's on DVD and Blu-ray, so be sure to watch that series as well. Thanks for listening, guys. Stay tuned for the next episode.